welcome back, everybody. Want to thank you for checking us out yet again. I am here. I am Nick, Pennsylvania, here as always with my good friend Brendan Bond. And happy to say we are here today. We are with our friend Mike, who is responsible for starting this all up in the first place. So it was nice for him to join us again. Hey, Mike. Woo-hoo. And just to give a quick update, there's some upcoming people hopefully going to be on in the very near future, including the triumphant return of our friend Chris, who spoke about haunted Fort Ligonier recently. Yes. I caught up with Chris recently. Yeah, good times. And he was very excited. He was kind of taken back by how much response he had gotten from being on here. So we want to thank everybody that's listening. A special thanks to Gateway China, in the wake of Chris appearing, sent us over some very nice mugs of Fort Ligonier, which was totally unexpected. So thank you for that. Our friend Brian will hopefully be coming back in the near future, probably so we can clean up after Chris and kind of talk about all of Chris's stories, as we seem to be setting a tradition. But of course, Bond and I have been talking to about some on-site stuff, and we have a few of those in the works as well. But that's enough about tomorrow. Let's talk today. And by today, I'm saying let's talk about yesterday, because Bond sent Mike and I over kind of a heads up about what he wanted to talk about. And this is something that goes back to the early to the mid-70s. And it was something I was kind of aware of personally, but I had to go back and read and watch a little bit about. So, Bond, tell us about this, what you brought to the table tonight.
Yeah, so what I kind of wanted to talk about tonight is the Philip experiment, and which I know we have referenced on in passing on previous podcasts. The reason I wanted to talk about this occurrence or this experiment is to kind of get on a little soapbox real quick. A lot of people have issues, one way or the other, with using science to try and explain paranormal phenomena. A lot of times you hear people say things along the lines of certain questions are for religion, certain questions are for science, and they don't often overlap. And that's something that I think is very lazy intellectually as a generalization. And here in this podcast, we try and push some of those things. Now, whenever we're looking for paranormal phenomenon, trying to like debunk or be honest skeptics a lot of times, we talk about evidence. And even when we talk about evidence, the thing that we always get caught up on is the idea of the mechanism, how these things work. Like, let's say they are happening. How do they happen? We have science as one of the two kind of arms between, rational thought and empirical thought to try and answer some of those questions. When it comes to science and the paranormal, I think there is a large correlation that doesn't get drawn very often, but I think should be looked into further, which is the idea of the placebo effect, which is not like one thing, as everyone knows, but it is a series of, kind of medical phenomena that is widely established as being a thing, even though we don't know how, why, or when it works the way that it does. Because we're actually talking about probably a number of mechanisms inside our own bodies that we don't have any data on, but we have evidence of those systems kind of existing. So in the scientific community, we're already looking at paranormal phenomena. We just call it the placebo effect. So the words that we use around these things and the lens that we look through really does color how much credibility we give paranormal activity. When we're talking about it in a medical sense, we might say placebo. Whenever we're talking about it in the, quote unquote paranormal realm, we might say, oh, it's a miracle, or it is something that was done through some other, again, mechanism that we don't quite understand. So that's why I want to talk about the Philip experiment, because it is an example of people at least trying. We'll get into how well they did it, but at least trying to use science to answer some of these questions. Now, the Philip experiment was conducted mainly by Dr. Owen, who was a trained mathematician. He led a group of 8 people from the Toronto Society for Cyclical Research. Now, these folks were not psychics. They're just people kind of like us who are just interested in the paranormal and happen to have a quote unquote society. What they decided to do was do an experiment where they basically tried to produce a spirit through expectation, imagination, and visualization, which is what in the paranormal and even like kind of existential communities, people often call intent or manifesting, things along those lines. Now, the people that were involved in this, to give you an idea of how kind of like normal they were, there was Dorothy, who was a housewife, Al, who was a heating engineer, Lauren, who was an industrial engineer, Andy, who was Lauren's wife, Bernice, who was an accountant. A member was named Sydney, who was a grad student, I believe, in sociology. There was a lady named Sue that they knew, Iris, who was the wife of Dr. George Owen. George Owen also had a psychiatrist named Joel Whitten, who was also there to observe and kind of conduct the experiment. So now what they decided to do was get together and create basically a spirit, a poltergeist, as they said. And they decided his name was going to be Philip, which is just kind of a fun name. So this is the story that they made up for Philip, and I'm going to read it to you now. Philip was an aristocratic Englishman living in the middle 1600s at the time of Oliver Cromwell, which is a very exciting time. He had been a supporter of the king and was a Catholic. He was married to a beautiful but cold and frigid wife. I don't know if we'd say that nowadays.
Let's say cold and frigid. So like they really wanted to drive home the temperature thing here.
Yeah, I don't necessarily like that language, but Dorothea, who was the daughter of a neighboring nobleman. One day, when out riding on the boundaries of his estate, Philip came across you know what? I'm not even going to say it. He came across an encampment. Her name was
Romany
Martha.
woman.
Yes,
let's say Romany woman.
Yeah, this is very dated, and I apologize. Her name was Margot, and he fell instantly in love with her. He brought her back secretly to live at his gatehouse near the stables of Dinglington Manor, his family home, which is a great name. For some time, he kept his love nest secret, but eventually Dorothea, realizing he was keeping someone else there, found Margot and accused her of witchcraft and stealing her husband. Philip was so scared of losing his reputation and the possessions to protest the trial. Margot then was convicted of witchcraft and burned at the stake. Philip was subsequently stricken with remorse that he had not tried to defend Margot and would pace the battlements of Dinglington in despair. Finally, one morning, his body was found at the bottom of the battlements, whence he cast himself in a fit of agony and remorse. And that's like their official story that they made up. Now, on top of that, they made up lots of other backstory information about this guy. And what they did is they got together in regular meetings to discuss the life and times of this fictitious Philip. So to be clear, they all know this person isn't real. They all helped create this story. And they would get together, talk about him, have these deep kind of meditations around him. They would have these conversations regarding him and the times, and just try to speak about him as much as possible in hopes that it would kind of conjure something. Then I'm not sure which one of the members, I wasn't able to find who suggested it, but they switched formats after some sources say a few months, some say as much as a year of not having any paranormal phenomena associated with this. They decided to switch to basically a seance format where they dimmed the lights, lit candles, and used a table. What ended up happening, though, is once they started doing this, a few weeks in, they started having things actually happen. The table would rotate, it would tilt, and we have the telltale tapping and rapping of traditional poltergeist activity during seances and things like that. It grew to the point where lights would flicker in the room. And again, these people all know this is made up, basically, but they're trying to put as much energy as possible into it. And through the rapping and tapping and table turning and everything, this quote unquote Philip that they were contacting through the seance answered questions that were consistent with his history. But apparently he didn't give any other information was like outside of the realm of what they had created. This was so successful that they actually videotaped and had an audience for one of the sessions, which again, for 1972, you can find the video. It is out there. It's fascinating. And again, this was so successful that Dr. Owen ended up, after they kind of concluded this experiment, he ended up doing it a few other times. One was with another being called Skippy Cartman, who was a 14-year-old Australian girl, and Lilith, a 18th century French Canadian spy, and then another man called Axel, who was from the future. So that's the Philip experiment in a nutshell. The Owen group theorized, at the time and later. I believe there was a book written. I couldn't find a copy of the book. I'm hoping one of you guys did. There was a book that was written where they basically theorized that the collective unconsciousness is what manifested this paranormal activity, the table turning, the table levitating, the knocking sounds. That was kind of their conclusion, is that through their own intent and through their own kind of like mental attention to this entity, it basically created the entity, even though there was no entity present before they started this. So as you can imagine, this leads to lots of questions, both about the experiment itself, but also what it means for paranormal investigations henceforth and the study of paranormal. So again, that's kind of the overall view of what happened. There's lots of thoughts on this thing out there, and I wanted to see what you guys thought about it. Not only you, Mike, and you, Nick, but also you guys, our audience, because it does bring up so many questions, and I think it leads us down a lot of interesting paths. So I guess that's where I kind of want to give it to you guys now a little bit and see what you guys thought about the Philip experiment. Mike, what are some of your thoughts initially about this?
I mean, as far as initial thoughts go, this is something I've heard over the years. I think I heard a podcast, an episode of maybe Lore or something. They talked about this. At first glance, obviously initial reaction could be, some type of hoax with parlor trick, stuff like that, the spinning table. That's stuff we've heard before in other stories as well. And then there's, also the route I would take if I were to assume that everything actually was happening as it was, and theorize why that might have manifested anything. If you want me to get into that now.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, because just to comment on what you said real quick, I think that there's the first thing we have to think of is okay, well, are we presuming that these people are all above board? I think the fact that they all knew this was a fictional character, I don't know, that to me that gives them credibility in the sense that all of them know this is going to be scrutinized, so no one kind of wants to be the one that lends doubt to their credibility. Yeah. But at the same time, you could also, just like you were kind of saying, look at the Fox sisters, look at a lot of other things.
It just has that air. It just looks like from the outside looking in at just what you see. I mean, compared to so many other seances and stuff like that, it's just it just has that feeling to it. But I'm not saying that it is. It's very well. It just kind of comes.
I'll go out
initially.
I'll go out and say that it is, and I've got a lot of thoughts about this. Like I said, I was vaguely familiar with this. I think I had seen something when I was a child watching In Search of, or something along those lines. And I went back and I watched some of the video of it, and I had a few thoughts. And the first being, I did think that it was an interesting idea to see if we can get these same sort of things and these same sort of feelings if we made it entirely, concocted the story from whole cloth and everybody was aware of it. I think that's a good idea. However, there are some problems I have with it. But let's just say, as Bond said, that everybody's on board here. Everybody is above deck. Was the phrase? Okay. Everybody's on the level. Everybody's on the level is the phrase I'm going to use.
There you go.
So what is the finding really? If this is all legitimate, to me, there's nothing supernatural about it because they're not manifesting a ghost. What they are manifesting is some sort of human thing that makes us do these things. And that to me says it's entirely natural, if not entirely known and well defined right now. So I think a group of parapsychologists and parapsychologist lay people, this kind of disproves something that they're going after. It's saying that given these conditions, we were able to recreate a thing which people claim in other places to be people talking to the dead. Well, clearly they're not talking to the dead, or at least that's not all that's going on. It's some sort of human thing, and I think this experiment, if totally legit, demonstrates that. Now, if you actually watch the footage, there's a lot going on. It's almost like a religious thing. They're all working themselves up into a fur, singing things like 99 bottles of beer on the wall. They're all also, like the Ouija board thing, touching the tabletop at all times, which makes me say, if for a control, could they reproduce those results without touching the table? Like, that would be another level. And I just have a couple final thoughts. Yeah, this goes back to something we've talked about before, and something that's been demonstrated is there's more evidence that suggests that there are locations and there are conditions which we perceive things to be haunted. And nothing, as Bond stated, according to the story here, none of this shenanigans started to really manifest until the conditions were what we would expect them to be. They would dim the lights and everything like that. And the man from the future, that's an interesting one, but I didn't really do a ton of research deep into this. I kind of did a cursory thing just earlier today, and I just kind of feel like the one of the big issues is, yes, they were able to replicate these things with different characters within their group, but other groups were not able to replicate them outside. But going back to the very, very first thing, this is my final comment before I give it back to you, Mike, is going back to the overlapping magisterium sort of thing. There are the supernatural and then there's the scientific world. I fear that a lot of times the people that make those statements are people that don't want a mystery to be solved, because of the romance of it. That there's a whole thing, like Jack the Ripper, there's that whole community around that. And this has been speculated that there are a lot of people that a part of them doesn't want it ever to be solved.
So are we qualifying this as a scientific experiment? Is that where?
Well, that's definitely what it was delivered as.
Yes, that's a really good question, Mike, because like if you're right, like we're missing a control group, like Nick said. So
well, also the experiments in general would be flawed because they're all say your hands are all on a table, that leaves doubt. They should have looked into better ways to convey that.
It definitely begs the next step would be, can this be replicated? Because what is the mechanism that hands must be on this for work? It's not a car battery, right? Or is it? And so these definitions aren't very good. So
no, but I think that actually gets to something interesting, Nick, is like the mechanism is, I think, the interesting thing that's being looked at here. Because again, and to be clear, I'm assuming that all of these people are honest their experiencing of the phenomena. Yeah, the actual quote unquote science side of it, the lack of a control group. There's not a lot of like, okay, let's try this, then this, and document both accurately. The science side of it isn't great when it comes to being clinical science. I think that it's an example of what happens a lot of times in the paranormal, where people use the guise of science. Like everyone's familiar with EMF meters and stuff like that. You're looking at, and last week we were talking about the intent of things, right? An EMF meter is meant to pick up fluctuations in electromagnetic fields in industrial equipment and wiring, things like that. It's not intended to pick up ghosts, so you're using a tool for something it was not intended to do, which doesn't mean it doesn't work, but don't confuse the two.
Well, and it can give you confusing results. Mike, I know early on when we were talking about these things, you've had to use similar devices at your work, and they can give you all sorts of different types of readings if you're not aware of what it's really saying.
Yeah, especially if you're not completely sure how to use it properly, for this proper application.
Absolutely. And I think that the whole proper application thing is all over the board here in this case. And again, the whole reason I wanted to talk about the Philip experiment here is just like as an example of these things happening. I don't want people to think that any of us think this is a great example of how to do a crossover between science and the paranormal. But I think that, like I said earlier, the language we use around it is important as well, as far as our perspective. Because like Nick, like you brought up the idea of the setting being created with the lights being dimmed and the candlelight and everything.
Got to get the mood right.
Yeah,
Barry White on the turntable.
Absolutely. And it's like, we'd like to normally think that if that's the case, then how can it be scientific in that sense? How can it be, a sterile environment? And I think that you touched on something else really interesting there, Nick, when you said like people don't want some of these things answered. If you say it is paranormal, if you say it is a miracle versus, like the placebo effect or something like that, you are assigning agency outside of yourself to it, and you are saying, I know the mechanism. Whereas, again, in a lot of cases, science says we do not know the mechanism. We only have evidence that a mechanism exists. Like, we're still a whole set of criteria away from even explaining it. We just know something's happening. And I think that's why examples of the Philip experiment, and even like we said with people using EMF meters, the reason that stuff is still at least interesting to me is because it does not give us definitions of the mechanisms of how paranormal activity happens. It absolutely does not. But it gives us at least a possible example of the shadow of that existing.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say this. With all the ghost hunter people out there that are using like thermal cameras and the EMF stuff, no, there's no real evidence, but I can understand like, hey, we think anytime anything anomalous is happening, we're wanting to document it, because the claim that we're out here trying to determine whether it's real or not is anomalous in and of itself. So I understand that thinking. I just think that is not, you're not yet to the point where you can, with any sort of confidence, say that because of this, therefore we have this and this is evidence of that. Well, no, all you really have is evidence of an anomalous thing. And as Mike stated, if you are not familiar with the appropriate use and all the different things that go around that, then you are more likely to see a mundane reading as being an anomalous reading, which is not the case. And I want to say one thing. I was away all last week in a hotel room, and I think that a lot of these ghost shows are starting to scrape bottom, because I swear to you, I saw a whole 2 episodes of something called Haunted Hospitals, and most of them didn't even take place in a hospital. They just happened to work in a hospital. It was much like when Animal Planet had some haunted show, and at some point in each episode, they had to mention that the people had pets.
No, I think those are, I mean, yeah, I completely agree. And I think that anytime someone, and I think scientists, when talking about science, would agree with this too. And I think paranormal folks, whether or not they're worried about proving something or not, could still take a page out of science's book, in the sense of saying, as soon as you are sure of something, like, just keep collecting more data, you'll probably be proven wrong. Either there'll be anomalies or something else. A book that was very very important for me was a book by Thomas Kuhn called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And basically it was about how paradigms in science shift. Like a big example is like going from no germ theory to germ theory. Now, granted, there are people before that that had speculated that maybe like smaller things that we don't see could exist. They had some anomalous evidence of it, but it was just that. In this book, what kind of Thomas Kuhn says in a roundabout way is that like there's what we know about science right now. And if you are very, very sure of all of those things on a long enough timeline, every one of those things will either be proven wrong or elementary in comparison to the mechanisms that make it up. I know we've said before, anytime someone says, oh, we know exactly how something works, that's kind of a red flag in the paranormal community. That's also a red flag in the scientific community, because if you are so sure of how something is working, you shouldn't fear further inspection of that and more data and contrary data.
Yeah, what's the old axiom? Something about the most intelligent, or like the scientific community, or something to that effect, are the most cautious to make any absolute claims, and it's only a radical sect that's going to, it's the ones without evidence that are going to be the most concrete in their statements. It's much more succinct than I just put it, but something to that effect.
No, but I think you're right. That's kind of the one of the things that keeps me going back and forth with a lot of paranormal quote unquote evidence is, not only a lot of times, like you were saying, Mike, is the provenance of it kind of, and rightly so, called into question and is kind of dubious at best sometimes. Or like you were saying, Nick, a lot of times it's very much a result of how you're viewing the data and the kind of lens you're looking at it through. All those things I think are fine, but you need to be aware of them whenever you're having these conversations. And a lot of times whenever I listen to, especially other podcasts, like you said, Nick, shows, just the lack of that kind of critical thinking whenever making claims about stuff is really, really kind of off-putting. And I think it gives a lot of this stuff a kind of a bad name, and why people look at it as like, as so crazy.
Well, and maybe it's that why people look at it so crazy. I think this might be one of those cyclical things where if you're an adult years ago and you believed in ghosts and whatnot, there was, say, places for to have those conversations, but there was also, as we became more technologically oriented, I guess, it became more and more, there was just a lot of people that are very dismissive of it in a negative way. And maybe that sort of fear of derision has made people very defensive, but that's not a good thing for either reason. And I think that's why we see so many examples of people who are like, look, this is real. I believe it's real. You can't tell me it's not. And any evidence I see that convinces me in the moment or at an emotional level, I'm just going to take and leave it at that and not make other considerations.
Well, let's look at some of the other considerations of the actual entertaining the paranormal side of it. If I had to theorize, like, assuming all the things that happened were actually happening, I don't think that it was what it was kind of portrayed as like a thought form or a tulpa. That's not the impression I got. What I think could have happened is they're opening up a space to be occupied by something, probably something that's not so good, something that is, we look at it as like a dark entity, even just poltergeist. But one of the things that kind of led me to this conclusion, that there's an article I read, same one that I know you guys had also read. They take a break and they all experience poltergeist activity. I don't know if they attribute it to Philip himself, but just the fact that this could have been some type of poltergeist, that they basically opened up a door for this thing to be Philip, is the best way to put it, I guess.
I would just come back with that and say, so the way I see it as is expressed is there's an entity of sorts kind of waiting out there in the wings, and only by a group of people singing 99 bottles of beer on the wall can it start messing around with a table's legs? Like that's where I'm getting at. It's like no. It's you're entertaining an idea. I'm not making fun of you, but it's one of those things like when they have the people that supposedly can talk to the dead and they get fabulous TV shows, and these relatives of people that only recently died who were like in the prime of their life, that's in part why it's such a tragedy, are suddenly so forgetful of how their name is spelled. Like, I'm getting an R, I'm on an R. They can make definitive statements later on, like you need to call her, you need to call some, but they can't remember what letter their name starts with all of a sudden. And that's kind of where I'm at. It's like that could be true, Mike. It could be true that there's some entity unknown to us, another dimensional thing, but it's just waiting for its chance to kind of mess up tables. Because they did, one of the things that Bond didn't mention is they did break a couple tables in this process. That's true. I mean, this is like Jack Kerouac's statement, like the Vietnam War was just a ploy by the Vietnamese to get a lot of Jeeps.
I think you're onto something there, Mike. I think that, and that isn't something I saw in too many of the articles that I read, is that, yeah, there is a serious, like, trickster.
Exactly. That's kind of what I was trying to go for. The whole trickster thing with children, you know, and they see another child spirit or a child spirit, and then they are befriended by this child spirit, and then they come to find out, well, it's not actually a child, it's some type of dark entity. And that's just kind of what, you know, led me down that path.
Yeah, and I mean, there's lots of examples of that in a lot of folklore, I think, of, again, like a trickster element, and that's... I thought I was going to get to go a whole episode without saying like it's all fae, but like it kind of has that vibe to it, right? It has whatever Nick was, you know, kind of like, again, not making fun of you, but saying how crazy it sounded. I'm like over here sitting here thinking, yeah, that sounds exactly like an old fae story that I would read in like the other folk or something like that, because it usually is. And again, why? I have no idea. But you have a lot of times these very specific criteria that make zero sense that need to be met for these things to happen. As much as that doesn't pass the eye test, if we're trying to be empirical about or rational about it, though, like how far removed is that from how crazy some of the stuff normally is? You know, as far as mechanisms we do understand, like how many things have to happen in your body for one small function to go properly. It isn't always a simple 1-to-1 A to B kind of thing. Sometimes there is some serious deviations, and just because they seem crazy to us doesn't necessarily mean that they're not without their reason. And that's why I think like the lens that we look through this stuff through is so important, because Nick, like you kind of, because of your background, I think immediately reminds you a lot of, you know, hoax, mediums,
pranksters.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Hucksters, whatever, you know, stirs in general. It reminds you of those really quickly. Whereas with Mike, it reminds you of like ghost stories that involve trickster elements, you know. Those are, I think that's dark spirits. I think that's our vocabulary that we typically use around these things, just kind of coming to the forefront, you know.
Well, it's a phenomenological thing in which your reality is created by your experience. And let me tell you something. I was a cameraman for a national TV show for one day. This is a true story. True story. Mm-hmm. And I know you both are familiar with this, but I'm not going to say what show, but it welcomes you every weekday morning. And I had to film a meeting between two parties, and it was supposed to be candid, but the first party was already there. The crew mic'd them up and everything, and the second party got there, and everybody said hi and spent about 20 minutes, and they mic'd them up, and then we spent 15 minutes getting shots of them pulling up to the house for the first time that they'd already been at for 20 minutes because they were already mic'd up. So whenever you see like TV and people are saying hi and everything, they all have microphones on already. They're not meeting. They've met. They've been hanging around for probably an hour. You know, so it's just anything I see on television because of that experience, I go, well, this is fake.
It automatically raises those suspicions for you, and again, and well founded. It's not like it's. I don't mean to act like you're being presumptuous by that.
Well, I mean, I definitely am, but
the common theme between Nick and I would be that we're both being untrusting.
that is truthfully accurate.
Yeah, I mean but I think because of the things that like you're talking about, Nick, a lot of us are kind of conditioned that way. And again, I think I've talked about this before, where I think we all have a meter of how much we're willing to entertain before we're like, But
I think that's a very accurate thing, and it's kind of being aware of like, what's the line for you? How far are you willing to go?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, but again, I think that's why it's important to talk about this stuff with some of these scientific elements, because it reminds us that those meters are in fact subjective. They have very little to do with actual reality or empirical evidence.
Well, I had a thought that I was interested to hear, Nick's input on, and Brennan's, but as somebody who's a writer, the whole idea of creating this character of Philip, it's not so far removed from somebody writing a book or even a TV show or movie, just that to have a character and a character development. So what is the big difference here apart from just them attempting to conjure up this entity?
No, I think there's a whole aspect of linguistics and which is a neo-Aristotelian, and sort of the neo-Aristotelian mindset is that language creates reality. Earlier, I mentioned the phenomenological, where experience creates reality, and I see these two things as being very similar. And the example I like to give people, and I think I've probably put it out here on this show before, is tomatoes for many years were thought to be poisonous, and not without good reason. Some people write that, well, it's because they were colored red, and red means danger. Well, but really the tomato is in the nightshade family, and we all know that nightshade is a very poisonous thing. And so for many years, people lived and believed, and their reality was that tomatoes were poisonous. They weren't, but they were. Pirsig, in his book, seminal book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, talks about, well, before Newton comes up with a theory of gravity doesn't really exist. And it's very much along the same way, the neo-Aristotelian, and it goes into, if you've ever read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, it talks about quality being the cleavage point between classical and romantic thinking, and Pirsig himself was very much a classical thinker who was having an ontological crisis. So, no, the line for me, I suppose, Mike, with this, because anybody that loves books or loves video games or a movie has encountered a fictional character that you have made something real in your mind and in your heart because you connected with them or you felt something for them. And we've all, almost to a person, have had that experience. Where the line is for me is when they're conjuring it and then they're crediting these abnormal activities to this creation. It's almost like I thought about making a pie, and then I'm thinking about making the pie and I stub my toe and I blame it on the pie. Well, no, it was me the whole time.
So let me, I understand what you're saying, Nick. To be clear though, about like what they said about this, it wasn't so much that they claim to have in fact created Philip, but it was more that their conclusion was that people who have had no history of psychokinesis or telepathic or medium or divination, people who had no abilities like that could come together and produce this phenomenon. Which I think is a little different.
It is. You're right. You're right. It is. And I encourage everybody to watch the actual footage, because they were on a TV show as well. Watch the footage. Because they continue to talk to Philip, so it's easy for me to forget that. But you are right.
Yeah.
You are absolutely right. But again, that's why I go back to my original statement, is that I feel like this group has effectively demonstrated that, if anything, this is an entirely human thing.
Which I think is still important, because I think
Agreed.
I think it was and Mike, you might be able to back me up on this. I believe it's Tim Renner who has said multiple times, let's say this is all coming from within us. Let's say all of this stuff is of our own creation. Isn't that just as fantastic and wonderful?
100%, because it's a mystery that we haven't wrapped our heads, we don't understand the mechanics of yet. It would be as miraculous to me as when DNA was sequenced.
Yeah. And that's why I think that when we're talking about like our meters of what we will entertain, the reason why I think mine is probably higher or lower, depending on your perspective, than a lot of people that I talk to, not necessarily you guys, but a lot of folks that I talk to about this stuff, is I'll entertain a lot of stuff because there is empirically so much we don't know. That's what we go back to whenever we hear stories from people. Like my first inclination is always to believe people are telling the truth, because and again, I'd rather honestly believe 10 liars and me be the idiot than not believe one person who was legitimately telling the truth. You know, I know we've said that before on this show. And I guess like that's why I entertain these things, and why I think that talking about the mechanics and the language and everything is so important, is because there's so much we don't know that I think it that should be all the more reason to look into these things in different ways and to scrutinize, but also to keep the romantic and wondering side of it.
Yeah, and I think with that, you know, this experiment they did, I would almost say it opens more questions than answers, you know.
That's another parallel, I think, between, you know, paranormal quote unquote research and a lot of scientific research, is whenever you do certain things, you often end up with more questions than answers. And
that's the word for it.
Yeah. No, yeah. I knew what you were getting at. But I think it goes back to what Nick said earlier about the idea of the romanticism of all of this on both sides, both the scientific and paranormal, that like the fact that there is still so much out there that we don't understand should be exciting, not discouraging.
Yeah, I agree.
I would encourage everybody who's listening, if you haven't looked into the Philip experiment, again, there's so much video documentation of it. Check it out. Let us know what you think. If you want to get into a raging argument with me, cool. Otherwise, if you don't want to, then your targets are Mike and Bond over here. And I'm sure they welcome it just as readily. Absolutely. Hey, Mike, you haven't gotten an opportunity to say it for a while. How can people reach out to us?
They can contact us at the Ghost Furnace Podcast at gmail.com, or contact us on Instagram or Facebook and YouTube.
I believe you are correct.